When Marcus Flynn signed the foreclosure papers on the old Ashworth Sawmill for $450, the bank clerk looked at him like he'd just purchased his own grave. Sarah Chen, a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes that had seen too many desperate transactions, set down her pen and leaned forward across the scarred wooden desk. "Mr. Flynn," she said, her voice carrying genuine concern rather than professional detachment, "are you absolutely certain about this? That building hasn't processed timber in 17 years. The roof is compromised. The machinery is rusted beyond salvage. Winter's already settling in, and we're looking at one of the coldest seasons Montana's seen in a decade." Marcus met her gaze steadily, his calloused hands resting flat on the contract between them. He was 33 years old, but felt decades older. The lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and calculations that never quite added up. His work jacket, clean but worn thin at the elbows, hung on a frame that had lost weight over the past 2 years. "I'm certain," he said quietly. Sarah studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the address listed on his current residence form. The Pineview Mobile Home Park Lot 17. She knew that park. She knew what $400 meant to someone living there. "You understand the property is sold as is with no guarantees or debt warranties of any kind. The bank assumes no responsibility for structural integrity code compliance or habitability." "I understand. And you're aware that the property taxes, while currently minimal, due to the structure's condemned status, will become your responsibility immediately." "Yes, ma'am." Sarah sighed and pushed the papers toward him one final time. As Marcus signed his name in the spaces she indicated, she said quietly, "My grandfather worked at that sawmill back in the 1920s. He always said Theodore Ashworth was the fairest man he ever knew. I hope there's some of that fairness left in those old walls for you, Mr. Flynn." Marcus looked up, surprised by the personal disclosure, but Sarah was already stamping the documents with the kind of finality that closed chapters and opened uncertain new ones. "The key is yours," she said, sliding a single brass key across the desk. "I truly hope you know what you're doing." As Marcus stepped out into the December afternoon, the key heavy in his pocket, he thought about Sarah's parting words. Did he know what he was doing? Not remotely. But knowing and doing had become separate things somewhere along the way, divorced by necessity and desperation. His pickup truck sat in the bank's parking lot, and its tailgate held closed with bungee cords because the latch had broken 3 months ago, and he couldn't afford to fix it. In the passenger seat, pressed against the window, with her breath fogging the glass, sat Emma. 8 years old with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that Marcus had learned to manage after 2 years of single fatherhood. She wore her winter coat, the one that was already getting too small, but would have to last another season. She turned as he climbed into the driver's seat, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that always unsettled him. Emma had developed that look over the past 2 years, a kind of watchful awareness that seemed far too adult for a child who should still believe in the invincibility of her parents. "Did you get it?" she asked. "We got it," Marcus confirmed, turning the key in the ignition. The truck coughed to life its engine, making a concerning sound that he'd been ignoring because everything made concerning sounds when you couldn't afford mechanics. "Is it nice?" Marcus thought about the 3-story industrial relic he'd viewed exactly once 2 weeks ago on a gray afternoon that had made the building look like something from a horror movie. He thought about the broken windows and the machinery frozen mid-operation like metal sculptures of abandonment. He thought about the vast, echoing emptiness of spaces designed for 100 workers now holding nothing but dust and memories. "It's big," he said finally, "and it's ours. That makes it nice enough." Emma nodded, accepting this logic with the resilience she'd learned when her mother walked out. She didn't ask follow-up questions. She'd learned as children of crisis learn that sometimes the answers hurt more than the uncertainty. Marcus drove through Millbrook, Montana, a town that had seen better days and knew it. Main Street held a hardware store, a diner, a gas station, and a bar called the Timber Room that probably served as the community's living room. Christmas decorations hung from lampposts, yet cheerful in that determined way small towns fight against economic decline. They passed the Pineview Mobile Home Park without slowing down. Marcus had already packed everything they owned, which fit embarrassingly into the bed of his truck. 2 suitcases of clothes, 1 box of Emma's toys and books, his tool bags, sleeping bags, and blankets, a camping stove, and a cooler containing what little food they'd salvaged. 3 trips to carry 8 years of Emma's life and 33 years of his own. The sawmill appeared as they rounded a bend in the county road, rising from acres of overgrown lot, like a monument to industrial dreams gone silent. The main building stood 3 stories tall, its dark timber exterior weathered to the color of old bones. Windows gaped like missing teeth, some broken, others merely black with accumulated grime. The roof sagged in places, bearing the weight of too many Montana winters without maintenance. A faded sign still hung above the main entrance letters, barely visible through decades of neglect. Ashworth Timber Company, established 1891. Marcus pulled into the gravel parking lot, weeds pushing through the stones like nature slowly reclaiming what man had abandoned. He killed the engine and sat for a moment staring at what $450 had bought him. Emma pressed against his side, despite her seatbelt, her small hand finding his larger one. "It looks scary, Dad." Marcus couldn't argue with that assessment. The sawmill looked like exactly what it was: abandoned, possibly dangerous, and definitely not the kind of place a responsible parent would bring a child to live. But responsibility, he'd learned, was a luxury you could only afford when you had choices. The mathematics were brutally simple: $450 for the building versus $800 a month for the moldy trailer they'd been calling home. The sawmill had 4 walls and a mostly intact roof. That made it a mansion compared to the alternative, which was his truck. "It's just old," Marcus said, injecting confidence he didn't feel into his voice. "Old doesn't mean bad. Old means sturdy. They built things to last back then. This building has stood for over 100 years. It'll stand a while longer." Emma looked up at him with eyes that held too much understanding for 8 years old. She'd developed that look over the past 2 years, since the morning they'd woken to find Rachel gone. Just a note on the kitchen table in handwriting that used to write love letters: "I can't do this anymore." No explanation of what this was, no forwarding address, no phone number that stayed connected beyond a week. Marcus had stopped trying to interpret Rachel's departure. Some questions didn't have answers worth finding, and some absences spoke louder than any explanation could. "Come on," he said, squeezing Emma's hand. "Let's see our new home." The December air hit them like a slap as they exited the truck, cold enough to sting exposed skin and turn breath into visible clouds. Marcus had checked the forecast that morning, temperatures dropping into the teens tonight, with snow possible by the weekend. They needed to get settled quickly, get heat running somehow. Make this cavernous wreck into something survivable before the real cold arrived. The brass key slid into the main entrance lock with surprising ease, as though it had been waiting for exactly this moment. The door was massive, probably magnificent once, now hanging slightly crooked on hinges crusted with rust. It swung open with a groan that echoed through the space beyond, a sound like the building itself waking from a long sleep. The smell hit them first: dust, machine oil, and something organic that Marcus couldn't quite identify. Decay, maybe, or just time concentrated and undisturbed. What little December light filtered through the grimy windows revealed a vast open space filled with silent machinery. Massive bandsaws stood frozen at angles, suggesting mid-cut. Conveyor systems stretched into shadows, their belts cracked and sagging. Timber processing equipment hulked in the dimness like sleeping giants, as if the workers had simply walked away one day and never returned, which Marcus suspected was probably close to the truth. Emma stayed close to his side as they ventured deeper, their footsteps echoing on concrete floors scattered with debris. The main processing area occupied most of the ground-level cathedral ceilings, lost in shadows above. The space had been designed for noise and motion, for the screech of saws and the rumble of machinery. Its silence now felt unnatural, like a held breath waiting to be released. Metal stairs led to a second floor where offices had once operated. Marcus could see doors hanging open up there, filing cabinets visible through gaps, desks buried under years of accumulated dust. A break room with a sink, a bathroom that might or might not still function. "Can we really live here?" Emma asked quietly, her voice sounding small against the enormous space. Marcus surveyed their new home with what he hoped looked like optimism. The building was a disaster. Yes, it needed work that would take months, maybe years. But it had bones, good bones built in an era when construction meant permanence rather than planned obsolescence. "See that office up there?" He pointed to a large windowed room on the second floor, the one with the big window facing east. "We'll clean it out, set up our beds. I can rig up some heating, get the electricity turned on properly. Maybe hang some curtains, make it cozy. It'll be an adventure. I don't like adventures anymore, Emma said softly. The words hit Marcus harder than she probably intended. Emma used to love adventures. Before Rachel left, before the construction work dried up with the first snow, before their life became a series of increasingly desperate compromises, Emma had been fearless. She'd climbed trees, explored creeks, invented elaborate games that could occupy her for hours. Now she flinched at changes, clung to routine, and looked at the world through eyes that expected disappointment. Marcus knelt down to her level, his knees protesting against the cold concrete. He put his hands on her shoulders, waiting until she met his eyes. I know things have been hard, baby. I know you didn't ask for any of this. But I promise you we're going to be okay. This place might not look like much now, but it's ours. Nobody can kick us out. Nobody can raise the rent. We just need to make it livable, and I know how to do that. That's what I do, remember. I build things. I fix things. Emma studied his face with that too perceptive gaze that made him feel simultaneously proud and protective. You promised. Marcus had learned the hard way that promises to children carried weight you couldn't always bear. But what else could he offer her? What else did he have except his word and his willingness to work until his hands bled? I promise we'll try our hardest. That's all anyone can ever really promise, sweetheart. But my hardest has always been pretty good. It wasn't much of a promise, but it was honest, and honesty was something he could give her when he had little else. Emma seemed to accept this, nodding slightly before turning her attention back to exploring their strange new home, her small figure moving through the shadows with cautious curiosity. They spent the remaining daylight hours doing basic reconnaissance. Marcus tested light switches and discovered to his relief that the electricity still functioned, though several fixtures had burned out bulbs. The power company would need to transfer the account to his name, which meant fees he couldn't quite afford, but at least the wiring seemed intact. The plumbing proved more problematic. Water flowed when he turned on a rusted faucet in what had been the facility's bathroom, but it ran brown for several minutes before clearing to something approaching transparency. The toilet functioned, which Marcus counted as a significant victory. They could survive without a lot of things, but working plumbing ranked high on the list of non-negotiables. The upper floors revealed more offices, each one a time capsule of abandonment. Desks still held papers, calendars frozen on dates from 2007. Filing cabinets stood open, their contents spilling out in drifts of yellowed documents. A break room refrigerator had become a science experiment in mold cultivation. But there were also things they could use. Cleaning supplies in a storage closet still sealed in their original packaging. Basic tools scattered in drawers. Even a few folding chairs that might be serviceable once wiped down. Small victories, but Marcus had learned to celebrate those. As the winter sun began its early descent, casting long shadows through the broken windows, Marcus started hauling their possessions from the truck. Everything they owned in 3 trips, suitcases bumping up metal stairs. The camping stove cradled carefully, Emma's box of treasures carried with the reverence it deserved. He chose the largest office on the 2nd floor for their living space. It had windows facing east, which would catch morning sun and help warm the room naturally. The doors still closed properly, which mattered more than Marcus wanted to admit. Privacy, security, the ability to shut out the enormity of the building around them. Marcus swept out the worst of the dust and debris, then laid out their sleeping bags on the floor. The camping stove went in one corner, their food supplies in another. Emma arranged her toys on the windowsill with careful precision, creating order in the chaos, making the space her own in the way children must when the world keeps changing. It's like camping, Marcus offered, watching her sort through her stuffed animals with the seriousness of a curator. Camping is supposed to be temporary, Emma replied without looking up. Marcus didn't have a response to that. Instead, he focused on the practical tasks that would get them through the night. Heating would be the immediate challenge. The sawmill had ancient radiators throughout connected to a boiler system that Marcus suspected hadn't functioned in years. For tonight, he'd brought a small electric space heater that would at least keep their room from freezing. Tomorrow, he'd investigate the boiler situation. Tomorrow, he'd figure out how to make this work long-term. But tonight, they just needed to survive. They ate dinner sitting on the floor of their new room, sandwiches made from supplies Marcus had picked up at the gas station on their way into town. Emma chewed slowly, her eyes wandering around the bare office walls, taking in every detail with that watchful gaze. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, turning the windows into black mirrors that reflected the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The sawmill made sounds at night, Marcus discovered. Wood creaking as temperatures dropped, metal groaning as old joints contracted, wind finding its way through gaps in the structure with whispers that sounded almost like voices. Normal sounds for an old building, Marcus told himself, even as they raised the hairs on the back of his neck. Then Emma said suddenly and without preamble, "Tell me about Mom." The request surprised Marcus. Emma rarely asked about Rachel anymore. The first few months after she'd left, Emma had asked constantly, "Where was Mom? When was she coming back?" Did she not love them anymore? Marcus had fumbled through explanations that satisfied neither of them, eventually settling on variations of, "Mom needed to figure some things out," and "It's complicated." After a while, Emma stopped asking. Marcus had thought that meant acceptance. Now he wondered if it had just been retreat, a child learning not to probe wounds that wouldn't heal. "What do you want to know?" Marcus asked carefully. Emma picked at her sandwich, pulling apart the bread in small, precise movements. "Do you think she's ever coming back?" Marcus had wrestled with this question himself for 2 years. Rachel had left no forwarding address, no contact information beyond a cell phone number that disconnected within a week. She'd emptied their meager joint savings account, $532, that represented their emergency fund, and vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. For the first year, Marcus had harbored hope. He'd check his phone obsessively, certain she'd call. He'd watch for her car in parking lots, convinced she'd realize her mistake and come home. He'd kept her clothes in the closet, her toothbrush by the sink, maintaining the fiction that this was temporary. The second year had been about accepting that she wouldn't, about boxing up her belongings and donating them to Goodwill, about explaining to Emma again and again in different words that never quite worked, that sometimes people leave and they don't come back, and it's not because of anything you did wrong. "I don't know, honey," Marcus said honestly. "I used to think she would. Now I'm not sure. Maybe she's happier wherever she is. Maybe she needed something we couldn't give her. I stopped trying to figure it out because it was making me crazy." "Do you want her to come back?" The question was more complicated than Emma probably realized. Did Marcus want Rachel back? The woman who'd walked out on their daughter without explanation, the person who'd chosen escape over fighting through the hard parts, part of him still loved the Rachel he'd married. The woman who'd laughed easily and dreamed big and made him believe anything was possible. But that Rachel had been gone long before she'd physically left. The woman who'd walked away was someone he didn't recognize, someone capable of abandoning her own child. "I want you to have a mother who loves you," Marcus said carefully. "Whether that's your mom, Rachel, or whether we have to figure out a different way, I just want you to feel loved and safe." Emma absorbed this quietly, then said in a voice so small it barely carried across the space between them, "I feel safe with you." The simple statement nearly broke Marcus. He pulled Emma close, feeling her small body relax against his, and held her while the old building creaked around them and the heater hummed its electric song. "Good," he managed to say. "That's good, baby. That's all I want." They finished dinner in comfortable silence. Marcus cleaned up their minimal dishes while Emma prepared for bed, changing into her pajamas and brushing her teeth in the cold bathroom down the hall. The space echoed with every sound, magnifying the ordinary into something strange and new. When she returned, Marcus tucked her into her sleeping bag and read to her from one of the books they'd brought, a battered copy of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory that had been Emma's favorite before everything changed. She fell asleep halfway through the chapter, her breathing evening out into the deep rhythm of childhood rest. Marcus continued reading softly for a few more minutes, reluctant to stop this small piece of normalcy. Finally, he closed the book and simply sat there, watching his daughter sleep in their strange new home. The sawmill's night sounds continued, a symphony of settling and shifting that Marcus told himself was perfectly normal. He checked the space heater to make sure it was functioning safely, positioned far enough from the sleeping bags and any combustible materials. Then he settled into his own sleeping bag, the floor hard beneath him, even through the padding. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds and the persistent thought that he'd made a terrible mistake. $450 for a condemned building. Their entire future resting on his ability to make this work. But what choice did he have? The trailer rent had been 3 weeks overdue. The landlord had been patient, but patience had limits. Another week and they'd have been evicted, their belongings set out on the frozen lawn for neighbors to see and pity. At least here in this vast industrial wreck, they had walls and a door that locked. They had space and possibility. They had time to figure things out without someone counting days until eviction. At some point in the early morning hours, exhaustion finally won out over anxiety, and Marcus slipped into restless sleep. He woke to pale winter light filtering through dirty windows, and Emma already awake sitting cross-legged on her sleeping bag with her notebook and colored pencils. Marcus had bought her that notebook 3 months ago, back when he'd still had steady work, back when small gifts felt possible. She'd filled half of it already with elaborate drawings of imaginary worlds that looked nothing like their actual life. "Morning, kiddo," Marcus said, his voice rough from sleep and cold air. "Morning," Emma replied without looking up from her drawing. "The building makes weird sounds at night." "Old places do that. It's just the wood settling, the temperature changing. Nothing to worry about." Emma nodded but didn't look convinced. Marcus couldn't blame her. In daylight, the sawmill looked less menacing, but no more welcoming. Just old, vast, and fundamentally empty. Marcus made them a basic breakfast on the camping stove, instant oatmeal, and coffee for himself. The cheap kind that tasted like burnt water, but contained enough caffeine to make consciousness bearable. As they ate, he outlined his plan for the day. First priority was getting the boiler system evaluated. If it could be repaired, they'd have heat throughout the building. If not, he'd need to figure out alternative solutions before the real winter cold set in. Second priority was making their living space more habitable. That meant deep cleaning, finding or building proper furniture, maybe hanging some curtains to make it feel less institutional. "Can I explore while you work?" Emma asked. Marcus hesitated. The sawmill was large, potentially dangerous with its old machinery and questionable structural integrity, but keeping Emma confined to one office seemed cruel, and he couldn't watch her constantly while trying to assess the building's systems. "You can explore the second floor," Marcus compromised, "but you stay away from the machinery downstairs, and you stay where I can hear you if you call." "Deal." "Deal," Emma agreed readily. They spent the morning in parallel tasks. Marcus descended to the boiler room, a dark cave beneath the main processing floor, accessed by a narrow staircase that creaked alarmingly under his weight. The boiler itself was a monster from another era, a massive cast-iron beast covered in a maze of pipes and valves that looked like something from a steampunk nightmare. Marcus knew basic construction and maintenance, but this antique equipment was beyond his expertise. He'd need to call on a specialist, which meant money he didn't have. Meanwhile, Emma's footsteps echoed overhead as she wandered the second-floor offices. Occasionally, she'd call down to him, reporting her discoveries. An office with old maps still pinned to the walls. A storage room full of ancient hard hats. A break room with a calendar frozen on March 2007, the month someone had finally given up. Marcus was making notes on the boiler system, trying to determine what might be salvageable, when Emma's voice cut through the building with unusual urgency. "Dad, Dad, come quick." Marcus was up the stairs faster than he thought possible, his heart hammering against his ribs. Emma's tone hadn't been panic exactly, but something close enough to send adrenaline flooding through his system. He found her standing in front of a wall at the far end of the second-floor hallway, an expanse of dark wood paneling that looked identical to the rest of the building's interior. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked, scanning for danger, for structural collapse, for any of the 100 catastrophes that could befall a child in a derelict building. "Nothing's wrong," Emma said, her eyes bright with excitement rather than fear. "But look at this." She pressed her hand against what appeared to be solid wall, and a section of the paneling swung inward with a soft click, revealing a narrow doorway Marcus would have sworn wasn't there moments before. "It's a secret door," Emma whispered, as if speaking loudly might close it again. "I was leaning against the wall, and I felt it move." Marcus approached cautiously, examining the mechanism with growing amazement. The door was cleverly designed, invisible when closed, operated by a hidden catch disguised as a decorative knot in the wood grain. Beyond the doorway, darkness suggested a space larger than a simple closet. "Stay here," Marcus instructed, Emma pulling out his phone and activating its flashlight function. He stepped through the hidden door, ducking slightly beneath the frame. The room beyond was roughly 12 feet square, windowless, and completely concealed within the building structure. As Marcus swept his phone light across the space, it revealed something that made his breath catch in his throat. The room was furnished. A heavy wooden desk dominated one wall, its surface clear except for a leather-bound ledger. Shelves lined another wall filled with what appeared to be record books and files organized with meticulous care. But what commanded Marcus's attention was the opposite wall where a large portrait hung in an ornate frame. The painting showed a man in his 60s dressed in the formal style of the early 20th century. He sat in a chair with one hand resting on a cane, his expression stern but not unkind. There was intelligence in the painted eyes and something else too, a kind of weary determination, as though the subject had fought many battles and won most of them, but at a cost he hadn't fully anticipated. Beneath the portrait, a small brass plate bore an inscription. Marcus had to step closer to read: Theodore Ashworth, 1867 to 1943, founder Ashworth Timber Company. "What is it?" Emma called from the doorway, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. "It's a hidden office," Marcus said slowly, still processing what he was seeing. "I think it belonged to the man who built this place." Emma slipped past him despite his earlier instruction to stay put, her eyes wide as she took in the secret room. In the phone's light, dust motes danced like tiny spirits, undisturbed for decades until their arrival. Why would someone hide their office? Emma asked a reasonable question that Marcus had no answer for. He moved to the desk, examining it more closely. The wood was dark with age but well maintained, as if someone had cared for it right up until the building's abandonment. The leather ledger sat centered on the desk surface, pristine, despite the dust covering everything else. Marcus reached for it, then hesitated. Something about this felt significant, like opening that ledger would cross a threshold he couldn't uncross. Which was ridiculous, he told himself. It was just an old book in an abandoned building he'd legally purchased. Whatever was inside belonged to him now, along with everything else on the property. He opened the ledger. The first page contained a single line of text written in precise, old-fashioned script. "For the one who finds this, having purchased what others abandoned, you've earned the right to know what they never did." Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he turned to the next page where detailed entries began. Not business records as he'd expected, but something else entirely. Instructions, locations, and numbers that made his vision blur as he tried to process what he was reading. "Dad," Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you okay?" Marcus looked up from the ledger to his daughter's concerned face, then back down to the page before him. The page that contained directions to 6 different locations on the Sawmill property. The page that listed in precise detail assets hidden over decades by a man who'd apparently trusted no one with his fortune. Theodore Ashworth had died 75 years ago, and if this ledger was to be believed, he'd left behind something worth far more than $450. Marcus spent the next 3 hours locked in that hidden room, while Emma sat cross-legged on the floor outside, entertaining herself with her notebook and colored pencils. The ledger contained 78 pages of Theodore Ashworth's careful handwriting, each entry dated and detailed with the precision of a man who'd built an empire from sawdust and determination. What Marcus read rewrote everything he thought he understood about the property he'd purchased for less than a month's rent. Theodore Ashworth hadn't trusted banks. That much became clear within the first dozen pages. The man had lived through the stock market crash of 1929, watched neighbors lose everything to institutions they'd believed were safe. So he'd created his own security, systematically hiding portions of his wealth across the Sawmill property in 6 separate caches. Gold coins, bearer bonds, cash in denominations that would seem quaint now, but represented fortunes in their time. The ledger provided maps, measurements from permanent landmarks, depth specifications. Everything needed to recover what Theodore had called his legacy insurance. But it was the personal observations scattered throughout that gave Marcus pause, that made this more than a simple treasure map. Theodore had opinions, philosophies, regrets that bled through the careful accounting. An entry dated August 15, 1934, built the Eastern Cache today. Buried enough to keep Sarah and the children comfortable if the banks fail again. Preston watched me work, but asked no questions, showed no curiosity about why his father might be digging holes on his own property. The boy takes everything for granted, believes wealth appears through birthright rather than effort. He will inherit this business and likely destroy it. So be it. A man can only control what he can control. Another from June 22, 1938. The land remembers. Trees I planted 40 years ago now tower over the mill. Families I employed in the 90s now send their sons to work here. What we build becomes part of something larger than ourselves. Preston sees only the immediate, the transactional. He will sell this all eventually, I have no doubt. But the land will remain, and maybe someone worthy will find what I've hidden and understand what it means. The final entry was dated March 17th, 1943, 2 weeks before Theodore's death, according to the brass plate beneath his portrait. His handwriting had grown shakier but remained legible. My son believes this business is his birthright, earned through blood alone rather than character or commitment. He has no understanding of what built this company, no respect for the men who labored here, no vision beyond his own comfort. I have made provisions. Let the land decide who is worthy of what I've built. Let time separate the patient from the entitled. Whoever finds this will have purchased what my son will surely abandon. May you prove worthier than my blood. Marcus read that final entry 3 times, trying to parse the bitterness in those words. A father disinheriting his son not through legal channels, but through concealment. Theodore had apparently left the sawmill to his son in his will, along with the house and the timber contracts. But the wealth he'd accumulated, the foundation of everything he'd built that he'd hidden away, with instructions only discoverable by someone who actually occupied the property long enough to stumble upon its secrets. The son had clearly sold everything off eventually. The dates on the abandoned paperwork Marcus had seen suggested the sawmill had operated sporadically through the 1970s before closing permanently around 2007. 64 years of the Ashworth family slowly liquidating their inheritance without ever finding what really mattered. And now that inheritance belonged to Marcus Flynn, a 33-year-old construction worker who'd bought the property in desperation, not ambition. The numbers in the ledger were staggering. Even accounting for inflation and the possibility that some caches might have been discovered or deteriorated over time, Marcus was potentially looking at enough money to change his and Emma's lives permanently. Not just solve their immediate crisis, but rewrite their entire future. If it was real, if Theodore hadn't been delusional, if the caches hadn't already been found by urban explorers or previous owners, if the landmarks referenced in the maps still existed after 7 decades, if Marcus could actually locate and excavate the hiding spots without drawing attention or legal complications. Too many ifs. But also, what choice did he have? The ledger was either legitimate or it wasn't. The only way to know was to look. Marcus emerged from the hidden room to find Emma had drawn an elaborate picture of the secret door, complete with dramatic rays of light emanating from the opening, like something from an adventure movie. She looked up as he stepped out, her expression curious but patient. Emma had learned patience the hard way through broken promises and disappointed expectations. "Did you find treasure?" She asked the question so direct it startled a laugh from Marcus. "Maybe," he said honestly. "I found a very old book with some interesting information. I need to do some investigating to know if it means anything." "Can I help investigate?" Marcus considered this. He'd need to survey the property, identify the landmarks Theodore had referenced, possibly start excavating. Some of that work Emma could participate in safely. And honestly, the idea of having company while he pursued what might be an elaborate wild goose chase appealed to him. "Yeah," Marcus said, "you can help. But first we need to get some supplies." They drove into Millbrook, the nearest town of any size, with the ledger locked in Marcus's truck's glove compartment. The town center consisted of one main street lined with businesses that had clearly seen better days. A hardware store called Davidson's that looked like it had been there since Theodore Ashworth's time. A diner with faded red booths visible through the windows. A gas station. A bar called the Timber Room that probably served as the community's social hub. Marcus parked outside Davidson's, the interior smell of sawdust, metal, and oil hitting him as they entered. An older man stood behind the counter, his weathered face and calloused hands marking him as someone who'd done more than just sell tools over his lifetime. "Help you find something?" the man asked, his voice carrying the slow cadence of someone who'd lived his entire life in small-town Montana. Marcus had prepared a mental list: shovels, a good flashlight, work gloves, a metal detector if they carried one. Equipment that could serve multiple purposes but would primarily help him search for Theodore's hidden caches. "Need some excavation supplies," Marcus said. "Shovels, maybe a pickaxe. And I'm looking for a metal detector if you carry them." The man's eyebrows rose slightly, a subtle shift in expression that suggested curiosity rather than suspicion. "You the fellow who bought the old Ashworth place?" News traveled fast in small towns. Marcus shouldn't have been surprised. "That's me, Marcus Flynn." The man extended a hand that engulfed Marcus's in a grip that still held considerable strength despite his age. Tom Davidson. My grandfather worked at that sawmill back in the 20s and 30s. Said it was the best job in the county back then. Theodore Ashworth paid fair wages, treated his men right. Place hummed like a beehive in those days, running 2 shifts most of the year. Marcus felt a strange connection to the portrait hanging in that hidden room, to the face of a man who'd been dead for 75 years, but whose reputation still lingered. What happened to it? Marcus asked. To the company. Tom's expression soured, deepening the lines around his mouth. Theodore's son Preston. That's what happened. Man inherited a thriving business and ran it into the ground through pure neglect and greed. Wouldn't raise wages to stay competitive. Number. Modernize equipment, too expensive. Treat workers with respect beneath him. By the time Preston died in the 80s, most of the good timber contracts had gone elsewhere. His own son, Theodore's grandson, kept it limping along part-time until the recession hit in '07. Then he just walked away, left everything to rot. The story aligned perfectly with what Marcus had read in Theodore's final ledger entry. A legacy squandered by entitled heirs who'd never understood what built it. Well, Marcus said carefully, I'm hoping to make something of the place. Starting small, but who knows? Tom studied him with an assessing gaze that felt like it could see through polite deflection to the desperation underneath. What exactly are you planning to excavate? Marcus had anticipated this question and prepared a plausible cover story. Previous owners left a lot of junk buried around the property. Old equipment, scrap metal. Figured I'd dig it up, sell what I can for scrap, clean the place up proper. Tom nodded slowly, accepting this explanation, or at least choosing not to challenge it. Metal detectors are over here. Got a good one, a professional grade. Cost you, though. The detector was $230 more than Marcus had budgeted, but necessary if he was going to locate metal caches buried underground. He added 2 shovels, work gloves, and a heavy-duty flashlight to his purchases. The total came to $380, leaving Marcus with less than $70 to his name until he could find work. As Tom rang up the purchase, he said casually, You know, there have been stories about that sawmill for years. Folks say old Theodore hid money all over the property before he died. Urban legend type stuff, but the stories persist. Every few years, someone gets it in their head to go treasure hunting out there. Marcus kept his expression neutral, grateful for the practice he'd had hiding desperation from landlords and bill collectors. People say that about a lot of old places, usually just wishful thinking. Usually, Tom agreed, his eyes sharp despite his casual tone. But Theodore Ashworth wasn't like most people. Man survived the Depression by being smarter and more careful than everyone around him. Wouldn't surprise me if the stories had some truth to them. Of course, if there was anything to find, you'd think his own family would have found it in all those years they owned the place. Marcus loaded his purchases into his truck, hyper-aware of the ledger in his glove compartment. If there were already rumors about hidden wealth at the sawmill, he'd need to be careful. The last thing he needed was treasure hunters or opportunistic locals taking an interest in his activities. Emma had waited patiently in the truck, and now she examined the equipment with interest. Are we going treasure hunting? She asked. We're going investigating, Marcus corrected gently. Big difference. Treasure hunting is about getting rich quick. Investigating is about carefully seeing if something might be true. We dig carefully, we document what we find, and we don't tell anyone until we know what we're dealing with. Okay, Emma agreed, her expression solemn with the weight of secrets. Back at the sawmill, Marcus spread Theodore's maps across the desk in the hidden room, comparing them to the current property layout. The first cache was supposedly buried near what the ledger called the eastern marker stone. Marcus had noticed a large boulder at the property's eastern edge during his initial survey, probably weighing several tons, old enough and distinctive enough to have been there in Theodore's time. The kind of permanent landmark that wouldn't move or disappear over decades. The map indicated the cache was buried 12 feet due north of the stone's northern face at a depth of 4 feet. If the measurements were accurate, and if the cache hadn't been disturbed, Marcus was looking at an excavation that would take several hours but wasn't impossibly difficult. He and Emma walked the property as the winter afternoon light began to fade. Marcus carrying the metal detector and Emma helping him measure distances with a tape measure they'd found in one of the offices. The eastern marker stone sat in an area that had probably once been cleared, but was now overgrown with brush and small trees, nature reclaiming what man had abandoned. Marcus marked the spot the measurements indicated, then swept the metal detector over it. The device shrieked immediately, its readout indicating significant metal presence at approximately 4 feet down. Marcus's heart rate accelerated despite his attempt to remain skeptical. It could be anything, old equipment, scrap metal, exactly what he'd told Tom Davidson he expected to find. But the location was too precise, the depth too exact to Theodore's specifications. This was no coincidence. "Is there treasure there?" Emma asked, watching his face with that uncanny ability children have to read their parents' emotions. "There's definitely something metal buried there," Marcus said carefully. "Tomorrow when we have good light, we'll dig and see what it is." That night, Marcus lay awake in his sleeping bag, long after Emma had fallen asleep, his mind racing through possibilities and complications. If the cache contained what Theodore's ledger suggested, Marcus was looking at a life-changing discovery. But found wealth came with questions. Legal questions about ownership, tax questions about windfall income, practical questions about how to convert old currency and bonds into usable money without attracting dangerous attention. And moral questions too, the kind that kept honest men awake at night. Theodore had hidden this wealth intentionally, creating a system that rewarded patience and occupancy over blood inheritance. His descendants had apparently never found it had sold off the property without knowing its true value. Did that make the caches Marcus's by right of purchase? Or was he morally obligated to track down Theodore's living heirs and inform them of their grandfather's hidden legacy? Marcus knew what the law would likely say. He'd purchased the property and everything on it through legitimate foreclosure proceedings. Found assets on private property belonged to the property owner. But law and morality didn't always align, and Marcus had been raised by parents who'd valued doing right over doing well. He still hadn't resolved these questions when exhaustion finally pulled him under sometime after midnight. Morning arrived with frost on the windows, and Emma already awake, dressed, and clearly ready for their excavation project. Marcus made them breakfast, checked the weather forecast for the day clear and cold, and gathered their tools. The digging proved harder than anticipated. The ground was half-frozen, resistant to the shovel's blade. Marcus worked steadily, breaking through the top layer of frozen earth to reach the softer soil beneath. Emma helped by clearing away the dirt. He excavated, piling it neatly to one side with the kind of focus she brought to tasks that mattered. 2 hours of digging brought them to a depth of 3 feet. Marcus's back ached, his hands were blistered despite the gloves, and doubt had begun creeping in. Maybe the metal detector had picked up old equipment. Maybe Theodore's map was deliberately misleading, a final joke on whoever might find it. Then his shovel struck something solid with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty property. Marcus dropped to his knees at the bottom of the hole, using his gloved hands to brush away soil from what his shovel had hit. Metal emerged, pitted with rust, but intact. A box maybe 2 feet long and a foot wide, constructed from heavy steel. No lock, just a simple latched lid. "Is that it?" Emma called from above, leaning over the edge of the hole to see. "Is that the treasure?" Marcus lifted the box carefully. It was heavy, substantial in a way that suggested contents beyond empty metal. He climbed out of the hole and set the box on level ground, Emma crowding close to see. The latch resisted, briefly rust, and time making it stubborn, then gave way with a squeal of protest. Marcus lifted the lid, his hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Inside, wrapped in oil-treated canvas that had survived 7 decades underground, were neat stacks of gold coins, double eagles. Marcus recognized them from history books and antique shows. $20 gold pieces minted in the early 20th century. He counted quickly, 50 coins, maybe more, beneath the top layer. At modern gold prices, even accounting for a condition, he was looking at somewhere north of $100,000 in the first cache alone. "Daddy!" Emma whispered, her eyes huge in her small face. "We're rich." Marcus stared at the gold coins gleaming dully in the winter sunlight, at this impossible windfall that had materialized from desperation in a child's curious hands. Rich. The word felt foreign, impossible. 48 hours ago, he had had less than $500 to his name and no prospects beyond hoping construction work resumed in spring. Now he was looking at more money than he'd ever earned in a year, possibly in 5 years. And this was just the first of 6 caches. We need to be very careful, Marcus said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. We can't tell anyone about this. Not yet. Not until I figure out what we're supposed to do. Emma nodded seriously, understanding in her own 8-year-old way that this changed everything, that secrets this big required careful handling. It's our secret, she said. Our secret, Marcus agreed, already reburying the box and marking the location carefully so he could retrieve it later. No point leaving evidence of their discovery visible to anyone who might wander the property. They spent the afternoon filling in the hole, restoring the ground to something approaching its original appearance. Marcus's mind churned through implications and possibilities with every shovelful of dirt. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Marcus researched inheritance law and found property regulations on his phone, squinting at the small screen in the dim light of their makeshift bedroom. The legal situation seemed clear enough. He'd purchased the property through legitimate foreclosure proceedings. Assets found on the property belonged to him. Theodore Ashworth's heirs had owned the land for decades and sold it off without discovering what lay beneath. Their loss, legally speaking. But Marcus kept coming back to Theodore's final entry, to the bitterness of a father disappointed in his son, to the deliberate construction of a system that would only reward someone who actually lived on and worked the property. Theodore hadn't wanted his son to have this wealth. He'd engineered things specifically to prevent it. Marcus had stumbled into Theodore's trap, but a trap designed to catch someone worthy rather than exclude the unworthy. The question was, did that make him worthy? He was just a guy who'd run out of options and bought the cheapest roof he could find. Did that qualify him for a windfall that could solve every problem he'd ever faced? His phone rang, startling him in the quiet office. Unknown number, local area code. Marcus answered cautiously. Marcus Flynn, a woman's voice, professional and clipped. Speaking. My name is Rebecca Ashworth Chen. I understand you recently purchased the Ashworth Sawmill property. Marcus's stomach dropped. Ashworth, a descendant, calling him the same day he'd found Theodore's first cash. The coincidence was too precise to be accidental. That's right, Marcus said carefully. Can I help you with something? I'd like to meet with you, discuss the property, its history. I'm Theodore Ashworth's great-granddaughter. My family has some interest in the site's historical preservation. Historical preservation code for searching for Theodore's rumored hidden wealth, most likely. Tom Davison's casual mention of the legends suddenly seemed less innocent. Word had spread that someone new owned the sawmill, and now Theodore's descendants were circling. I'm not looking to sell, Marcus said. I'm not looking to buy, Rebecca countered smoothly. Just to talk. I'm in town tomorrow. Perhaps we could meet at the property, say 10 o'clock in the morning. Marcus wanted to refuse, but curiosity won. He wanted to see what Theodore's great-granddaughter knew what she wanted. And maybe despite everything, he wanted to look her in the eye and decide for himself whether she deserved to know about the wealth her ancestor had deliberately hidden from her family. 10 o'clock works, Marcus agreed. After the call ended, Marcus sat in the dark office listening to Emma's peaceful breathing and the old building's nighttime sounds. Tomorrow would bring complications. He wasn't prepared for a confrontation between blood inheritance and earned discovery, between what was legal and what might be right. He pulled out the ledger again, reading Theodore's final entry by phone light. But the land hadn't decided anything. Chance had. Desperation had. Marcus had bought the cheapest available shelter and stumbled into someone else's vendetta against their own family. Outside, an owl called in, the winter darkness, its voice echoing across the empty property. Marcus closed the ledger and tried to sleep, knowing tomorrow would force choices he wasn't ready to make. Rebecca Ashworth Chen arrived exactly at 10 o'clock, driving a silver sedan that looked aggressively out of place against the sawmill's industrial decay. She emerged dressed in what Marcus recognized as expensive casual wear, the kind of clothing designed to look effortless while probably costing more than his monthly grocery budget used to be. Mid-40s, he guessed, with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and the confident posture of someone accustomed to being taken seriously broadly in rooms where she was often the only woman. Emma watched from the second-floor window as Marcus descended to meet their visitor. He'd told his daughter to stay inside during the conversation, a precaution that felt increasingly necessary as Rebecca approached with the measured stride of someone assessing property value with every step. Mr. Flynn, she said, extending a hand, thank you for agreeing to meet. Her handshake was firm, professional. Marcus noted she wore no wedding ring despite the hyphenated surname, and her eyes were already scanning the sawmill's exterior with an intensity that had suggested more than casual interest. Miss Ashworth Chen, Marcus replied, you said you wanted to discuss the property's history. Please call me Rebecca. She turned her full attention to him, and Marcus recognized the expression he'd seen on contractors' faces when they were sizing up a job, trying to determine cost versus profit. She was trying to determine what kind of person she was dealing with, how much he might know, what leverage she might have. My great-grandfather built this place, Rebecca said, her gaze sweeping across the weathered timber and broken windows. It's been in my family for over a century, even if we no longer own it. Your family sold it, Marcus pointed out, keeping his voice neutral. Several times, from what I understand. It went through at least 3 different owners before the bank foreclosed. Rebecca's jaw tightened slightly, the only crack in her professional composure. My uncle made decisions I didn't agree with. He saw the sawmill as a burden, an unprofitable relic draining resources better spent elsewhere. He never understood what Theodore built here, what it represented. Marcus gestured toward the building looming behind them. And what did Theodore build here exactly? Rebecca turned to study the sawmill, her expression shifting to something that might have been genuine nostalgia or might have been a calculated performance. Marcus couldn't tell which. An empire for a time. Theodore Ashworth came to Montana with nothing in 1890. By 1920, he controlled timber contracts across 3 counties. He employed over 200 men, at the operation's peak paid them fairly, treated them with respect when other mill owners were crushing strikes and cutting wages. My great-grandfather believed in building something that would last a legacy for his family. But it didn't last, Marcus said quietly. No, Rebecca's voice carried bitter acknowledgement. My grandfather Preston inherited ambition without skill, arrogance without vision. He spent 40 years slowly dismantling what Theodore built, cutting corners, alienating workers, losing contracts to competitors who actually invested in their operations. And my uncle finished the job selling off the equipment piece by piece until there was nothing left but the building itself. She turned back to Marcus, and he saw something shift in her expression, a transition from historical lecture to present purpose. Which brings me to why I'm here. There are family stories about Theodore, things he may have left behind that weren't part of the official estate. There it was. Marcus kept his expression carefully neutral, a skill he'd learned from years of dealing with skeptical landlords and impatient creditors. What kind of things? Rebecca studied him carefully before responding, as though weighing how much to reveal. Theodore didn't trust banks. The Depression reinforced that distrust in ways that shaped the rest of his life. Family legend suggests he may have kept assets hidden on the property insurance against economic collapse. My uncle dismissed these stories as fantasy, refused to even consider searching. But I've done research, Mr. Flynn. I've found reference in old journals, cryptic mentions in letters. I believe the stories are true. And you want to search my property for your great-grandfather's hidden treasure? Marcus said flatly, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. I want to recover assets that rightfully belong to Theodore's bloodline. Rebecca corrected, her voice taking on a sharper edge. You purchased the building and land, Mr. Flynn. No one disputes that. But if there are family heirlooms or assets hidden here, those weren't part of the sale. They remain family property regardless of who owns the dirt they're buried under. Marcus had anticipated this argument during his sleepless hours the previous night. That's not how property law works. I bought the land and everything on it. Anything found on the property belongs to me. Legally, perhaps, Rebecca conceded, though her posture suggested she wasn't conceding much. But morally, these are my family's assets, hidden by my great-grandfather for his descendants. The fact that my grandfather and uncle were too blind or lazy to find them doesn't change the fundamental ownership. And the fact that Theodore apparently hid them specifically so his son wouldn't find them. Marcus asked quietly, watching her reaction. Does that change the fundamental ownership? Rebecca's eyes widened, slightly genuine surprise breaking through her professional demeanor. What do you know about that? Marcus realized his mistake too late. He'd revealed knowledge that shouldn't be accessible to someone who'd only owned the property for 3 days. But backing down now would only make things worse, would suggest he had more to hide than he'd already admitted. I found Theodore's hidden office, Marcus said, meeting her gaze steadily. And I found his ledger. I know exactly what he thought of his son and why he hid what he hid. For a long moment, Rebecca simply stared at him, her carefully constructed approach apparently derailed by this revelation. Then unexpectedly, she laughed. A sound without much humor, but genuine nonetheless, as though she'd been preparing for a chess match only to discover her opponent had already moved half the pieces. So you actually found it, the room everyone whispered about but no one could locate. How? My daughter has a talent for finding things that don't want to be found, Marcus said, thinking of Emma's small hand pressing against the hidden catch, her excited voice calling him upstairs. Rebecca's expression shifted, calculation replacing surprise as she processed this new information. Then you know where the caches are located. You know what's buried here. I know what might be buried here, Marcus corrected, maintaining the lie by omission. I haven't verified anything yet. Rebecca didn't need to know about the gold coins currently reburied 12 feet north of the eastern marker stone, about the weight of them in his hands, or the way they'd gleamed in winter sunlight like possibility made manifest. Rebecca pulled a business card from her purse, holding it between two fingers, like a white flag or an opening gambit. Mr. Flynn, Marcus, I understand this puts you in a difficult position. You purchased this property legally, and you have every right to anything you find here. But I'm asking you to consider the ethical dimensions. Theodore was my family. His wealth was built through generations of work. Does the fact that you happened to buy this building give you moral right to everything he accumulated? Does the fact that you share his blood give you moral right to wealth he specifically hid from his descendants? Marcus countered. Rebecca flinched as if struck, and Marcus saw something genuine in her reaction, something that looked like pain. You read what he wrote about my grandfather. I did. Preston was a difficult man, Rebecca said quietly, her professional mask slipping to reveal something more vulnerable beneath. Entitled, arrogant, dismissive of others. Everything Theodore wrote about him was probably true, but that doesn't define our entire family. I barely knew Preston. He died when I was 12. I'm not asking for this inheritance because I think I deserve it through some divine right of blood. I'm asking because I've spent my adult life trying to understand Theodore, trying to honor what he built in ways my grandfather and uncle never did. Marcus studied her, trying to gauge sincerity versus manipulation, trying to determine if this was rehearsed emotion or genuine feeling. What does that mean, honoring what he built? Rebecca pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos before handing it to Marcus. The images showed historical documents, photographs, research materials, organized with academic precision. I'm a historian, Mr. Flynn. I specialize in early 20th century industrial development in the American West. I've written 2 books about timber industry evolution, about the immigrant entrepreneurs who built Montana's economy from raw wilderness. Theodore's story is part of that history, and I've been documenting it for 15 years. Marcus scrolled through the images, seeing academic articles bearing Rebecca's name, photographs of Theodore at various stages of his life, copies of Sawmill operational records. The research was extensive, genuine, representing years of dedicated work. So you want the money to fund more research, Marcus asked. I want the money because I'm 46 years old, divorced, teaching adjunct classes at 3 different colleges to make ends meet, and living in my sister's basement, Rebecca said bluntly, her voice carrying the kind of honesty that comes from exhaustion with pretense. I want it because I'm Theodore's great-granddaughter, and I'm broke while his wealth sits buried on properties sold off by people who never appreciated what they had. I want it because, yes, it would help me, and unlike my grandfather and uncle, I would actually do something meaningful with it. The raw honesty in her voice surprised Marcus, cut through his defensive skepticism to something he could relate to. He'd expected legal arguments or emotional manipulation, not this direct acknowledgement of personal desperation. He realized something he understood intimately. 2 people standing on opposite sides of an inheritance, neither of them had expected, both struggling with circumstances beyond their control. I need time to think about this, Marcus said finally. Rebecca nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing slightly, as though she'd been braced for immediate rejection. How much time? I don't know, a few days at least. And in the meantime, you'll what? Excavate what you can and then decide how much to share. Marcus met her gaze steadily, recognizing the fear beneath her challenge. In the meantime, I'll read more of Theodore's ledger, understand what he wanted, and try to figure out the right thing to do, which is more consideration than you or your family gave this place for 70 years. Rebecca absorbed this quietly, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression, a kind of resigned acceptance. That's fair, she said eventually. More than fair, actually. She held out the business card again, and this time Marcus took it. That's my number. When you're ready to talk, call me. And Marcus, thank you for not just telling me to leave. After Rebecca departed, Marcus stood in the Sawmill's parking lot, turning her business card over in his hands. Dr. Rebecca Ashworth Chen, Associate Professor of History, a scholar struggling to survive in academia's precarious economy, researching the legacy her own family had abandoned. The irony wasn't lost on him. Emma emerged from the building, having apparently watched the entire conversation from her window perch. Was that lady mad? Not mad, Marcus said, slipping the card into his pocket. Frustrated, maybe disappointed. Is she going to take our treasure? Our treasure. Emma had already claimed ownership in the simple, absolute way children understood possession. Marcus crouched down to her level, putting his hands on her shoulders. It's complicated, kiddo. That lady is related to the man who hid the treasure. She thinks it belongs to her family. But we found it, Emma said with perfect 8-year-old logic. And we bought the place where it was hiding. That makes it ours. Marcus wished adult morality were that straightforward, that questions of right and wrong came with clear answers instead of uncomfortable ambiguity. Sometimes what's legal and what's right aren't the same thing. I need to figure out which matters more. Over the next 3 days, Marcus excavated the remaining 5 caches, working during the hours Emma was at the small school he'd enrolled her in. Each location yielded treasures similar to the first metal boxes containing gold coins, old currency bearer bonds that Marcus suspected might still be redeemable through proper channels. The total value was staggering, easily over $500,000, possibly approaching $1 million, once he factored in the bond's potential worth and the numismatic value of coins in good condition. It was more money than Marcus had ever imagined, possessing enough to provide Emma with every opportunity she'd been denied. College education fully funded, a proper home instead of sleeping bags on office floors, security against every disaster life might throw at them. Everything a father could want for his daughter. But Theodore's words haunted him, echoing through his thoughts as he carefully reburied each cache and marked its location. On the 3rd evening, Marcus sat in the hidden office surrounded by the evidence of Theodore's careful planning. The portrait gazed down at him with that weary determination, and Marcus found himself speaking to it as though the old man might somehow hear across 7 decades of silence. I don't know what you'd want me to do, Marcus said quietly. Your great-granddaughter seems like a good person. She's spent years honoring your memory while her family forgot you. But you specifically hid this from your blood. You wanted someone else to find it, someone who'd actually live here and work here. The portrait offered no guidance, but Marcus hadn't expected any. The decision was his alone to make, and he'd been wrestling with it since Rebecca's visit. He thought about Emma, about the life this money could give her. He thought about Rebecca struggling in her sister's basement while teaching part-time at 3 different colleges. He thought about Theodore, bitter and disappointed, hiding his fortune from a son who'd proven unworthy. And he thought about the kind of man he wanted to be, the example he wanted to set for his daughter. Marcus pulled out his phone and called Rebecca. She answered on the 2nd ring, her voice tense with anticipation. Rebecca, I want to meet again. Tomorrow if you're available. Somewhere neutral. There's a diner in Millbrook, Rebecca said quickly. Helen's Place on Main Street. I know it. 2 o'clock. What should I expect, Marcus? Marcus looked up at Theodore's portrait, at the painted eyes that seemed to judge him across the years. Expect honesty, he said. That's all I can promise. Marcus arrived at Helen's Place 15 minutes early, claiming a booth near the back where they could talk privately. The diner smelled of coffee and frying bacon, comfortingly ordinary, against the extraordinary conversation he was about to have. Rebecca appeared precisely at 2, sliding into the opposite seat, with an expression that tried to mask desperation with professional composure. She looked like she hadn't slept well, and Marcus suspected he looked the same. Thank you for calling, she said. Marcus had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in his mind, trying different approaches, different ways of framing what he'd decided. Direct honesty seemed like the only version that felt right, that felt like something Theodore might have respected. I found all 6 caches, Marcus said without preamble. The contents matched Theodore's descriptions in his ledger. Rebecca's breath caught her hands tightening around the coffee cup the waitress had just placed in front of her. And I've spent 3 days thinking about what's right. Not what's legal, not what benefits me most. What's right. Marcus pulled out his phone showing her photographs he'd taken of the excavated boxes and their contents. Gold coins gleaming against oil-treated canvas, stacks of old currency, bearer bonds with denominations that seemed fantastical. Rebecca studied the images, her hand trembling slightly as she scrolled through them. How much? I estimate close to $1 million in today's value, possibly more depending on the bonds and collector value of the coins. My God, Rebecca whispered. Marcus set his phone down, leaning forward so she could see his eyes could judge his sincerity. Theodore wrote that he wanted the land to decide who was worthy. But land doesn't decide anything. People do. So I'm deciding. He paused, making sure he had her full attention. I'm keeping half. Rebecca looked up sharply, surprise and confusion warring in her expression. Half, well, half, Marcus confirmed. I purchased this property legally. I found these ties through my own effort and my daughter's curiosity. I need this money to give Emma a stable life opportunities she won't have otherwise. That's worth something. And the other half, Rebecca asked carefully, goes to you, not because you're entitled to it through blood, but because you're the only member of Theodore's family who actually cared about what he built. You've spent 15 years documenting his legacy while everyone else forgot he existed. That's worth something too. Rebecca sat very still, processing this offer that clearly wasn't what she'd expected. You're serious, completely serious. We split it down the middle. I use my half, however I want you to do the same. No legal fights, no arguments about who deserves more. Just a clean split between two people who both need help and both have reasonable claims. That's extremely generous, Rebecca said quietly. It's pragmatic, Marcus corrected. Fighting over this in court would cost both of us money and time neither of us can spare. This way, we both get enough to make real differences in our lives. You can finish your research, maybe get that tenure track position you were working toward. I can give Emma stability, maybe convert some of this building into something useful. We both win. Rebecca studied him for a long moment, and Marcus saw her eyes filling with unexpected tears. You could have kept everything. I have no proof the caches exist. No legal standing to demand anything. You could have told me you found nothing, and I'd have no way to challenge it. I could have, Marcus agreed, but then I'd be exactly the kind of person Theodore was bitter about. Someone taking what they didn't earn, claiming what they don't deserve. I'm not that person, and I don't want Emma growing up thinking that's acceptable. My great-grandfather would have liked you, Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. Maybe, Marcus said, or maybe he'd be furious I'm sharing with his bloodline at all. But I like to think he'd understand that sometimes the right answer is more complicated than absolute judgment allows. They worked out the logistics over the next week, meeting twice more at Helen's place to hammer out details. Rebecca brought in a discreet appraiser she'd worked with on historical projects, someone who could value the items without asking uncomfortable questions about their origin. The coins and currency alone totaled just over $800,000. The bearer bonds, surprisingly, were still redeemable through a lengthy but legitimate process, adding another $200,000 to the total. $1 million split evenly, $500,000 each. Marcus opened his first real bank account in years, depositing his share in careful increments that wouldn't trigger suspicious activity reports. Rebecca did the same, her hands shaking, as she completed the paperwork that would end her years of financial precarity. They met one final time at the Sawmill, both of them standing in the hidden office where Theodore's portrait still hung. Rebecca studied her great-grandfather's painted face with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read, something between reverence and sadness. I've looked at this portrait in photographs 100 times, she said softly. But seeing it in person in the room he designed to hide it, that's different. That makes it real in a way photographs never could. You could take it, Marcus offered. The portrait belongs with family. Rebecca shook her head firmly. No, it belongs here in the room he built. This is his real legacy, not the money. This secret office, these careful plans, this whole elaborate system he designed to outlast his disappointment. The portrait should stay where he put it. Marcus understood. Some things had value beyond ownership, meaning that transcended possession. 3 months passed like water, finding its level settling into channels carved by intention and hard work. The Montana winter had deepened and then gradually loosened its grip, giving way to the tentative promise of early spring. In that time, the Ashworth Sawmill had begun its transformation from industrial mausoleum to something living again. Marcus stood in the main processing floor on a Tuesday morning in late March, watching workers install the final sections of the new heating system. The massive boiler he'd worried about that first week had proven salvageable after all, once a specialist had assessed it and declared the core mechanics sound beneath decades of neglect. The restoration had eaten a chunk of his budget, but it meant the building would have reliable heat throughout, which mattered when you were trying to convince craftspeople to lease workspace in a structure most locals still called haunted. Emma attended Jefferson Elementary, now a school with actual funding and teachers who remembered her name. Marcus drove her there each morning in a reliable Honda CR-V he'd purchased with cash, the kind of transaction that had made the dealer suspicious until Marcus explained he'd sold family land. It wasn't entirely a lie. The Sawmill property had become family in a way the Pineview Mobile Home Park never could. The change in Emma over 3 months had been remarkable. She'd made friends, genuine ones, who came over for supervised playdates in their renovated living quarters. She'd joined the art club and discovered a talent for watercolors that her notebook sketches had only hinted at. Her drawings had evolved from mechanical precision to something more joyful paintings that included bright skies and smiling figures instead of just careful architectural studies. But the most significant change was subtler. Emma no longer flinched when Marcus mentioned plans for next week, next month, next year. She'd begun to believe in a future that extended beyond immediate survival, to trust that the ground beneath them wouldn't shift without warning. Rebecca visited every few weeks, combining research trips to Millbrooks County archives with what had become an unexpected friendship. She'd quit 2 of her 3 adjunct positions, using her half of Theodore's inheritance to fund serious academic work for the first time in her career. The book she was writing, the comprehensive study of Theodore Ashworth and immigrant entrepreneurs in Montana's timber industry, had attracted interest from a major university press. "This could be my tenure book," she'd told Marcus during her last visit, unable to keep the hope from her voice. "The thing that finally gets me off the adjunct treadmill." Marcus had poured her more coffee and listened as she described her research, the interviews with descendants of sawmill workers, the archival photographs she'd unearthed, the economic data that showed how places like the Ashworth Sawmill had built entire communities. Theodore's story was larger than one man's bitterness toward his son, she explained. It was about what happened when vision met determination, when immigrants with nothing built empires from raw materials and sheer will. "Your great-grandfather would be proud," Marcus had said, and Rebecca's eyes had gleamed with tears she didn't quite shed. On this particular March morning, Marcus was meeting with a local furniture maker named James Chen, no relation to the bank clerk Sarah who'd processed the original purchase. James was interested in leasing one of the ground floor workshop spaces, and Marcus had spent the past week preparing a tour that would show the building's potential without overselling its current limitations. James arrived at 10, a man in his late 30s, with sawdust perpetually dusting his clothes and an appraising eye for structural integrity. He walked the space, slowly testing floorboards, examining ceiling joists, asking practical questions about electrical capacity and ventilation. "The bones are good," James said, finally running his hand along one of the massive timber support posts. "Really good. They don't build like this anymore." "No," Marcus agreed. "They don't." "Rent?" Marcus named a figure he'd calculated carefully, low enough to attract craftspeople who needed affordable space high enough to cover the building's maintenance and slow accumulation of reserves for future repairs. James nodded immediately, which made Marcus wonder if he'd priced it too cheaply, but the handshake that followed felt right anyway. "When can I move in?" "First of next month," Marcus said. "I'll have the lease paperwork ready by then." James became the first official tenant of what Marcus had started calling the Ashworth Workshops, though the name felt presumptuous given that he was just renting out space, not building an empire. But Rebecca had insisted the name honored Theodore better than any museum designation could. "He wanted this place to work," she'd said, "to serve a purpose. You're giving it that." By May, 3 more spaces had been leased. A potter named Sarah Martinez, who worked in stoneware, and needed the high ceilings for her kiln's ventilation. A leather worker who'd been operating out of his garage and jumped at the chance for professional space. A metal worker specializing in custom furniture who'd heard about the sawmill through James and arrived with deposit check in hand. Marcus had also begun converting sections of the second floor into residential lofts, starting with proper renovation of his and Emma's living quarters. No more sleeping bags on bare floors. They had real beds now, a small kitchen-hard area, a bathroom that didn't echo with industrial emptiness. Emma had helped choose paint colors, insisting on a soft blue item for her room that reminded her of summer skies. "It makes me happy," she'd explained simply, and Marcus had bought 3 extra gallons just to be sure they'd never run out. The loft conversions were slower going than the workshop spaces. Residential occupancy required meeting code requirements that industrial space didn't, which meant inspections and permits and the kind of bureaucratic navigation that made Marcus grateful for his construction background. But he'd completed 2 additional units by early summer, both of which rented immediately to craftspeople who'd been commuting from neighboring towns. Tom Davidson from the hardware store had become a regular presence at the sawmill, stopping by under the pretense of checking on supply orders, but clearly fascinated by the building's transformation. He'd taken to teaching informal workshops on traditional joinery techniques, passing along skills his grandfather had learned while working for Theodore. "Feels right being here," Tom said one afternoon, running his weathered hands over a piece of oak James was preparing to shape. "Like the building's waking up after a long sleep." Marcus understood the sentiment. The sawmill did feel alive again in ways that had nothing to do with simple occupancy. There was energy here, the kind that came from people creating things from shared purpose and mutual support. The craftspeople had formed an organic community, trading skills and sharing equipment, covering for each other during family emergencies or rush orders. Sarah the potter helped the metalworker with glazing techniques for his steel pieces. James built display shelving for the leather worker. Marcus found himself in the middle of a small ecosystem he'd accidentally created, watching something Theodore might have recognized despite the centuries separating them. On a warm evening in late June, Marcus climbed to the hidden office as he did most nights after Emma was asleep. He'd kept the room exactly as they'd found it, preserving Theodore's desk and shelves and the portrait that still hung, watching over everything with that expression Marcus had come to think of as patient rather than stern. 6 months, Marcus said quietly to the painted Theodore. "Half a year since we moved in. Emma's thriving. The building's coming back to life. I think you'd approve, or at least I hope you would." He settled into the chair behind Theodore's desk, something he'd started doing when he needed to think through difficult decisions. The leather felt worn smooth by a previous occupant's years of use, comfortable in a way that suggested Theodore had spent many hours here planning, worrying, building his empire one careful decision at a time. Marcus pulled out the ledger, which he still kept in the desk's locked drawer. He didn't read it anymore, had memorized the important passages weeks ago, but holding it connected him to the man who'd written those bitter, hopeful words about worthiness and legacy. A soft knock on the hidden door interrupted his thoughts. Emma's voice came through the wood panel. "Dad, are you in there?" Marcus smiled. Emma had gotten good at finding the hidden catch, could open the door as easily now as she'd discovered it that first time. "Come in, sweetheart." Emma entered already in her pajamas, carrying her current watercolor project. She'd been working on it for a week, a painting of the sawmill as it looked now, with bright windows and people visible inside working at various tasks. "I finished it," she said, holding up the painting with shy pride. Marcus studied the image, seeing the building through his daughter's eyes. Emma had captured something essential about the transformation, the way light now spilled from windows that had been dark for 17 years, the way the structure seemed to lean slightly forward, as if welcoming rather than warning away. In the foreground of her painting, tiny figures walked toward the entrance, too small to show detail, but suggesting purpose, community, belonging. "It's beautiful, Emma. Really beautiful." "It's for you," she said, "to put up in here, maybe near the old painting." Marcus felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. His 8-year-old daughter, who'd learned to expect disappointment and guard against hope, was offering him art that celebrated their strange found home. "I'd be honored," he said. "We'll get it framed properly, hang it right next to Theodore." Emma beamed, then climbed into his lap the way she used to before she'd decided she was too big for such things. They sat together in comfortable silence, Emma's small weight warm against his chest, both of them looking at Theodore's portrait. Do you think he's happy we're here? Emma asked. Marcus considered the question seriously, looking at the painted eyes that had watched over this room for three-quarters of a century. I think he's glad someone finally found what he hid, and I think he'd be proud that we're using it to help people instead of just keeping it for ourselves. Because sharing is better than being selfish, Emma said with the absolute certainty of childhood moral clarity. Because sharing is better than being selfish, Marcus agreed. As summer deepened into August, the sawmill's transformation accelerated. Marcus completed 2 more residential lofts, bringing the total to 5 occupied units. The workshop spaces were all leased now, with a waiting list developing as word spread about affordable space in a building with good bones and better community. The Millbrook Town Council had noticed the revival too. They'd approached Marcus about presenting at a community development meeting, wanting to understand how an abandoned industrial building had become an economic hub. Marcus had declined, politely uncomfortable with the attention, but the council's interest had led to something useful, a small business grant to help with continued renovations. It wasn't much, $15,000, but it allowed Marcus to install proper security systems and begin addressing the building's exterior, replacing broken windows and treating timber against further weather damage. The sawmill would never look new again, but it could look cared for, which seemed more important anyway. Rebecca's visits had become more frequent as her book project progressed. She'd interviewed Marcus extensively about the discovery and his decision to share the inheritance, framing it as a case study in how legacy transcends blood when handled with integrity. "You're going to make me sound nobler than I am," Marcus had protested during one interview session. "I'm going to make you sound exactly as noble as you are," Rebecca had countered, which is plenty. She'd also started documenting the sawmill's current incarnation, photographing the workshops and interviewing the craftspeople about what the space meant to them. The before and after narrative, she explained, would form the book's conclusion, showing how Theodore's vision of community-centered industry had found new expression a century after his death. "It's poetic, really," Rebecca had said. "Theodore built this place to employ people, to give them purpose and income and dignity. You're doing the same thing, just with a different model. Same spirit, new century." Marcus wasn't sure about the poetry, but he understood the parallel. Theodore had created something that served people, and Marcus was trying to honor that fundamental principle, even if the specific expression had changed. One August evening, Marcus received a phone call from an attorney in Billings. The voice on the other end was formal, careful, asking if he was the Marcus Flynn who owned the former Ashworth sawmill property. "That's me," Marcus confirmed, immediately wary. Legal calls rarely brought good news. "My name is Richard Patterson. I represented the estate of Preston Ashworth Jr., Theodore Ashworth's grandson. He passed away last month at age 87. He left specific instructions in his will regarding your property." Marcus felt a chill despite the warm evening. Preston Ashworth Jr., the man who'd finally sold the sawmill in 2007, had been dead for years as far as Marcus knew. But apparently that had been Preston Sr. The grandson had survived into his late 80s. "What kind of instructions?" Marcus asked carefully. "Mr. Ashworth became aware of the property's revitalization under your ownership. His niece Rebecca kept him informed, though they weren't close. He wanted you to have something." 3 days later, a package arrived via courier. Inside, wrapped in protective paper, was a photograph in an old wooden frame. The image showed the sawmill in its prime, probably from the 1920s, based on the vehicles visible in the background. Timber stacks rose like small mountains around the building. Workers posed in organized rows before the main entrance, their faces too small to distinguish individually, but their collective presence speaking to the operation's scale. And standing prominently in the front row, looking perhaps 40 years younger than in the portrait hanging in the hidden office, was Theodore Ashworth himself. A letter accompanied the photograph, written in shaky script that suggested it had been composed near the end of Preston Jr.'s life. Marcus read it sitting at Theodore's desk in the hidden office, Emma asleep down the hall. The sawmill settled into its nighttime quiet. "Mr. Flynn, I will never meet you, but my niece Rebecca tells me you are a man my grandfather would have respected. I was not such a man. I inherited my father's business without inheriting his character, his vision, or his dedication. I spent 40 years proving my unworthiness, destroying what my grandfather built through negligence and pride. By the time I understood what I'd lost, it was too late to recover it. Rebecca tells me you found my grandfather's hidden wealth and chose to share it with our family despite having no legal obligation to do so. This act of generosity shames me. I could have searched for those caches myself in the decades I owned the property. I chose not to dismiss the family stories as fantasy, refused to honor my grandfather's memory by actually trying to understand him. I am sending you this photograph because it represents what the sawmill was meant to be, a place of work, purpose, and community. Rebecca tells me you have recreated that in your own way. My grandfather hid his wealth from me because I didn't deserve it. You found it and proved yourself worthy through what you chose to build. I have no right to ask anything of you, but I make one request. Remember that buildings are not legacies, people are. The sawmill mattered because of the lives my grandfather touched. The families he supported, the community he helped sustain. If you remember nothing else about the Ashworth name, remember that. Preston Ashworth Jr. Marcus read the letter 3 times, trying to parse the emotion in those careful words. Regret, certainly. Shame. But also something like peace, an old man making what amends he could at the end of his life. He hung the photograph in the main workshop space the next day, positioned where everyone who entered the building would see it. Several of the older craftspeople recognized elements of the image, remembered stories their grandparents had told about working for Theodore Ashworth when the sawmill had been the valley's economic heart. My grandmother worked in the office, Sarah Martinez said, studying the photograph intently. She always said Theodore was fair, which was rare for bosses back then. Paid women the same as men for the same work, which was practically unheard of. My great-uncle's in this picture somewhere, Tom Davidson said during his next visit, scanning the rows of workers. Can't make out faces, but he would have been there in the 20s. Said it was the best job he ever had, before or after. The photograph became a touchstone for the sawmill's community, a reminder that the building's purpose hadn't changed as much as it had evolved. Then it was employing 200 workers processing timber. Now it was housing a dozen craftspeople and 5 residents. Different scale, same fundamental principle, providing space for people to do meaningful work. Summer gave way to fall, and Emma started 4th grade with the confidence of a child who'd found her footing. She'd grown taller over the months, lost some of the watchful wariness that had defined her after Rachel's departure. She laughed more easily now, complained about homework, with the casual entitlement of a kid whose biggest problem was math worksheets. Marcus watched this transformation with gratitude that sometimes overwhelmed him. A year ago, he'd been 3 weeks from eviction, desperate enough to buy a condemned building for the price of a security deposit. Now Emma had stability, opportunity, a future that extended beyond mere survival. And he had something too, though it had taken him months to name it. Purpose, not just the satisfaction of providing for his daughter, though that mattered enormously, but the deeper fulfillment of building something larger than himself, of taking Theodore's bitter legacy and transforming it into something generative. The workshops hummed with activities 6 days a week now. James Chen had hired an apprentice, a young woman fresh out of high school, who was learning traditional joinery while building modern furniture. Sarah Martinez taught pottery classes on Saturday mornings, the sawmill's high ceilings echoing with laughter as amateur ceramicists discovered the joy of working with clay. The residential lofts had developed their own culture too. Marcus had converted 2 more spaces, bringing the total to 7 occupied units. The residents formed a kind of extended household, sharing meals, occasionally watching each other's pets or plants during travel, creating the kind of casual community that arose when people lived and worked in proximity with shared values. Rebecca visited in late October to conduct final interviews for her book. She'd been offered a tenure-track position at her university contingent on the book's publication, which the press had expedited based on the manuscript's quality. It's happening, she told Marcus over coffee in what had become their usual booth at Helen's place. After 15 years of adjunct hell, I'm finally getting a real position. Because of this book. Because of Theodore's story. Because you made the choice you made. You did the work, Marcus said. 15 years of research, that's all you. But you gave me the resources to finish it, Rebecca countered. And more than that, you gave me the ending. The book wouldn't work without the contemporary parallel, without showing how Theodore's vision found new life through someone who actually understood what he was building. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, still unused to being cast as any kind of hero in this story. I just rented out some space, he said. You created a community, Rebecca corrected gently. You took abandoned industrial space and made it serve people again. That's not just anything. As winter approached, Marcus began planning for the sawmill's first anniversary. A year since he'd signed those foreclosure papers, since Sarah Chen had looked at him like he'd purchased his own grave. A year since Emma had pressed her small hand against a hidden wall panel and changed everything. The craftspeople had started calling it the Ashworth Workshops. Without Marcus's input, the name spreading through word of mouth until it became official. Marcus had ordered a small plaque for the main entrance, Ashworth Workshops established 1891, renewed 2024. Below that, a quote from Theodore's ledger that Rebecca had suggested, "What we build becomes part of something larger than ourselves." The anniversary fell on a Tuesday in mid-December, a gray afternoon that mirrored the weather when Marcus and Emma had first arrived. But where that day had felt like desperation's last grasp, this one carried the warmth of accomplishment and community. The sawmill's inhabitants had organized a small gathering without Marcus's knowledge, everyone contributing food and decorations for what they were calling a reopening celebration. When Marcus arrived after picking Emma up from school, he found the main workshop space transformed with string lights and potluck tables, crafts, people and residents mingling with a handful of town locals who'd taken interest in the building's revival. Tom Davidson gave a short speech about Theodore Ashworth and the importance of remembering the valley's industrial heritage. He spoke about his grandfather's pride in working for a man who treated employees with dignity, about how places like the sawmill had built communities that lasted generations. Theodore would be pleased, Tom said, looking directly at Marcus. Not just that the building's alive again, but that it's being used in a way that honors what he believed in. That legacy matters more than bloodline. That worth comes from what you build, not what you inherit. Rebecca spoke next, more polished in her academic way, but equally heartfelt. She talked about legacy and reinvention, about how places could hold meaning across generations if people cared enough to preserve and transform them. "My great-grandfather built this sawmill to last," she said. The building lasted, but his vision nearly died when his descendants failed to understand it. Marcus didn't just preserve Theodore's legacy, he revived it, adapted it, made it relevant for a new century. That's the truest form of honor. Then Emma stood up, unexpected and unprompted, holding a poster board Marcus hadn't known she was working on. She created a timeline of the sawmill's history, illustrated with her watercolors and careful handwritten notes. "This building is 133 years old," Emma announced to the gathered crowd, her voice steady despite her age. "Theodore Ashworth built it when he came to Montana with nothing. He wanted to make something that would help people and last a long time." She pointed to different parts of her timeline, explaining the sawmill's peak operation, its slow decline, its years of abandonment, and finally its recent revival. "My dad says buildings are just buildings," Emma continued. "It's the people who matter. Theodore mattered because he was fair to the people who worked for him. My dad matters because he's making sure people can work here again." Marcus felt his throat tighten as he watched his daughter present her project with the confidence of a child who'd found her place in the world. This was who Emma was becoming, a kid who thought about history and legacy and what made places meaningful. When the formal speeches ended and the gathering dissolved into casual conversation and shared food, Marcus found himself standing near the photograph Preston Jr. had sent, looking at Theodore's younger self, surrounded by 200 workers. "Quite a weight to carry," a voice said behind him. He turned to find Tom Davidson, coffee cup in hand, studying the photograph with the familiarity of someone who'd looked at it many times before. "I don't think of it as weight," Marcus said. "More like responsibility. There's a difference." "There is," Tom agreed. "Weight crushes you. Responsibility shapes you." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, then Tom added, "My grandfather used to say Theodore was the kind of man who made you want to be better. Not through criticism or demands, but through example. You seeing what he built, you wanted to build something worthy too." "I'm not trying to measure up to Theodore," Marcus said. "I'm just trying to make this place work." "Same thing," Tom said with a slight smile. "That's what Theodore did. Just tried to make it work one day at a time. The legacy happened because he kept doing that for 40 years. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and Emma was asleep, Marcus climbed to the hidden office for what had become his nightly ritual. He settled into Theodore's chair, looking at the portrait that watched over everything with those patient eyes. "1 year," Marcus said quietly. "We made it a year. The building's alive again. Emma's thriving. We built something you and I across all these decades. He thought about Theodore's final entry in the ledger, about letting the land decide who was worthy. The land hadn't decided anything, of course. Marcus had stumbled into this through desperation and accident. But maybe that was the point. Maybe worthiness wasn't about deserving good fortune, but about what you chose to do with it when it arrived. Marcus had chosen to share when he could have kept everything. He'd chosen to build community when he could have simply extracted value. He'd chosen to honor Theodore's vision by adapting it rather than preserving it in amber. Whether that made him worthy by Theodore's standards, Marcus would never know. But standing in this office, knowing Emma slept safely down the hall, watching a building full of people doing meaningful work, Marcus thought maybe he was building something worthy regardless. He pulled out Emma's watercolor painting, which he'd had professionally framed as promised. In the morning, he'd hang it next to Theodore's portrait, creating a visual dialogue between past and present, between the empire Theodore had built and the community Marcus was nurturing. The sawmill creaked around him, old woods settling into winter cold, the sounds familiar now rather than frightening. Marcus extinguished the desk lamp and sat for a moment in darkness, feeling the weight of history and the lightness of possibility in equal measure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tenants to interview new repairs, to manage new decisions about how to balance preservation with progress. But tonight, Marcus allowed himself to simply exist in this moment, grateful for desperate choices that had led to unexpected grace for hidden rooms and patient ancestors for daughters who painted hope in watercolors. He thought about Theodore one last time before leaving the office, about a man who'd built an empire and watched his son destroy it, who'd hidden his wealth in bitterness and inadvertently created opportunity for strangers a lifetime later. "Thank you," Marcus whispered to the darkness, "for trusting that someone would find this, for believing that worthiness could transcend bloodline, for building something strong enough to last until someone who cared could bring it back to life." The office offered no response, but Marcus hadn't expected one. Some conversations were meant to be one-sided gratitude, expressed not for acknowledgement, but for the simple need to speak truth into silence. Marcus closed the hidden door behind him and walked down the hall to check on Emma one last time before bed. She slept peacefully, surrounded by her watercolor paintings and the security of a home that wouldn't disappear beneath her. Through the window, Marcus could see the lights of Millbrook twinkling in the valley below a small town that had reclaimed a piece of its history through his accidental stewardship. The sawmill's lit windows had added to that constellation beacon, announcing that this place lived again, that Theodore Ashworth's vision of purposeful work and dignified employment had found new expression in a new century. Marcus turned off Emma's light and made his way to his own room, feeling the particular exhaustion that came from meaningful work rather than desperate survival. Tomorrow would come with its demands and opportunities, but tonight belonged to rest and quiet satisfaction. He settled into bed listening to the sawmill's familiar nighttime symphony and allowed himself one final thought before sleep claimed him. They'd done it. Against impossible odds and through choices he still sometimes questioned, they'd taken something abandoned and made it alive again. They'd honored the past while building the future. They'd proven that legacy wasn't about blood or inheritance, but about what you chose to create with whatever chances life provided. The land hadn't decided who was worthy. Marcus had. And in choosing to share, to build, to honor what came before, while creating something new, he'd become exactly the kind of person Theodore had hoped would find his hidden wealth. Not because he was special or destined or particularly deserving, but because when given the choice between taking and giving, between hoarding and sharing, between preserving the past and honoring it through transformation, Marcus had chosen the harder, better path. That was legacy enough. Marcus closed his eyes and let sleep come content in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove himself worthy of the trust an angry, disappointed old man had placed in whoever stumbled upon his secrets. And in the hidden office down the hall, Theodore Ashworth's portrait kept its eternal vigil, watching over a building that lived again, because one desperate father had bought it for $450 and discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones we find, but the ones we choose to share. The end.